that is fine. So I'll say a little bit about Chris Lethaby's opening arguments at the end of my lecture here. And then I'll talk more about his book in Thursday's class or next week. But mostly what I want to do is make sure that I cover the rest of Blainey, because Blainey, as you can tell, hopefully, from how much time I've devoted to it, not just because it's long, but because it deals with a lot of the central themes from the course syllabus. And it deals especially with this ongoing question of like what does it mean to professionally study psychedelics today, right? Like why, like it's obviously really interdisciplinary, and so we're getting an anthropological perspective in this particular book. But at the same time, there's some basic things that matter. There's like how you narrate the history of psychedelics, as we covered on our midterms, matters. What kinds of, when we're thinking about religion, what kinds of baggage are we bringing with our concept of religion? What kind of baggage are we bringing with concepts of race? What types of structural inequities that exist, whether it's through colonialism, racism, sexism, that exist for us pervasively, unfortunately, in our society? How do they get refracted in the psychedelic world, right? That's kind of where we're at in the class. And so in the reading for Thursday, Blainey had gotten to some of the issues of infighting in a new religious movement, and it was kind of nice because he was talking about new religious movements in general. So I've asked this in class and face to face, but like one way to think about it might be to take the psychedelics out of the picture and look at ayahuasca religions alongside just any other new religious movement. So looking at ayahuasca religions next to UFO religions, or looking at ayahuasca religions next to other religions that use some kind of psychoactive substance, like Rastafaris using ganja, for example, and the concepts of ganja versus just like regular marijuana or something, right? So there are a lot of different ways to do it, and I think that I might disagree with some minor things with Blainey, but one of Blainey's one of his points is that these issues, whether so there's like some sexual abuse scandal. Are there sexual abuse scandals in other churches? Are there sexual abuse scandals in like the Catholic Church, for example? And so this broadly falls under this emergent category of spiritual care, right? And I think that there's a lot of new studies. There was recently a religious studies podcast back in January that was devoted to this issue. And I think it's becoming really, really big in the post-Me Too movement world, in our questions about race and gender as well. So we might think about like what are the boundary issues that are difficult in human intimate interactions with each other, and also like small group interactions, right? So of course there's a close parallel here between people who are doing therapists and becoming licensed therapists, and those people who are starting religions who don't have licenses necessarily. So sometimes in the psychedelic community, I hear people or read people in my online forums and stuff who say that they're against psychedelic religions getting recognized because there's no oversight structure for the religions themselves, and so children, minors, might be involved in some kind of situation that's beyond their control, all over both within the churches and in the non-affiliated I call it ayahuasca healing world, but psychedelic therapy world, there's been just buku amounts, like a lot of sexual abuse going on, and not just sexual abuse. Like there's the controversy around one Mexican guy, shaman. I don't think he's from Mexico, but he was practicing in Mexico. Who was using like a cattle prod on people, and so he was like, this self-professed shaman, and people were paying him lots of money, but then he was like, basically physically abusing him, and then you had some people pointing the finger that he was abusing them, and other people siding with him. You sometimes have victims of sexual abuse who identify with the person who abused them, or want to explain away. And so there's all sorts of controversies that come up that might be, if you were really studying it, you would need to do a closer ethnography of one particular group. But to come back to Blainey, so Blainey's kind of left this towards the end of his book. He's brought up like a lot of issues here. And I think that that's good that he's done that. In the overarching structure of his book, it comes just before he leaves us with like a very positive thing. So it's kind of like an argumentative structure for his book. It's like, he's talked about all this stuff for like 400 pages, and not quite 400, like 350 pages. And then he hits the quote dark side. He hits the quote opposition. And then he comes back around. He kind of rebuts it and says, this is a problem. These problems are pervasive throughout society. And where he comes down in his rebuttal of his argument, saying that he wants to side with psychedelic religious affiliations, is that they're overwhelmingly oppressed by drug war politics, that misunderstand the nature of ayahuasca, among other entheogens. And because of that misunderstanding, he feels like the churches need someone to speak up for them. And it's really important. I want you to remember that he's talking about churches here. I mean, this is a religious studies class. And so he's not just talking about one particular healing center. He really believes in protecting some sort of spiritual right. However we want to see that, we know that he's identified as an agnostic, and that he believes that it was partly his ayahuasca experience that leads Blainey to claim that term. And he pushes against methodological atheism. And so like we get a little bit more language at the end about explicitly methodological agnosticism. This is another, so this is like a mark of current anthropology, where you have more and more, not just classic participant observation as the methodology for the researcher, but that the researcher can in some way participate enough to maybe even be an initiate or a member of the church. And so then questions come up around, like how, if is your account going to be just like so biased because you're actually a member of the organization? Some of you, I think Bjorn mentioned this book that I really, really love, named Electric Santeria by Aisha Beliso de Jesus. And it's around here somewhere, but not right behind me, so I won't reach it. I believe Aisha's at Harvard, I think. But she was studying Santeria groups. In her book, you get the kind of sense that she's personally involved as an initiate, but she doesn't really quite come out and say so. But then in talks afterwards, like more and more, like it's kind of come out more that she is an initiate. And so we run into these kinds of issues in religious studies, especially when we write an academic book for academic credibility, what parts of our personal lives do we leave out? And what parts do we leave in? And where do those parts inform our scholarly stuff, and where do they make us potentially biased? So these are just open questions, and Blainey's book is very contemporary in that debate. And I've already brought it up with a couple of other people and in class. Um, if you look around page 362, he says, as a psychedelic researcher, I want to emphasize that Carhart Harris and his colleagues deserve praise. So he's going to critique Carhart Harris for a second here. Carhart Harris and his colleagues deserve praise for their impressive work on in the naturalistic laboratory, but as an anthropologist, I cannot help but problematize the hypocrisy of scientists flippantly dismissing theologies in which they are untrained, while at the same time decrying enchanted psychonauts' lack of scientific expertise. With such scientific evangelism, such scientific evangelism neglects to mention is that nobody can quantitatively measure metaphysical theories either way, and yet all too often materialist atheists remain unaware that their unchecked animus against religious meaning-making is itself based on blind faith in ontological psychicalism. And then skipping down a few lines. Heading into the future, a better anthropological approach must guard against all misuse of psychedelics while maintaining an agnostic appreciation of responsible entheogenic experiments in both science and spirituality. So then he discusses questions about secular society. He says that secular societies do not have to agree with Daimista's spiritual beliefs in order to recognize the latter's constitutional right to drink ayahuasca. And he doesn't mean this in First Amendment Constitution. He's a Canadian guy, but he means like one's own personal belief system, right? Or personal rights-bearing system. In fact, as empirical data is accumulating, an interdisciplinary consensus is emerging, which corroborates Daimista's conviction that their sacrament is safe and can have therapeutic properties. Excuse me. The meds that they put me on are like meant to flush all fluids from my body, which is one of the reasons why I didn't want to come into class today. But I'm getting dry throat. Okay. That his take on secular society is really interesting because it brings up, the issues of the secularization thesis. So on the one hand, Blainey wants to claim from a liberal rights-based position that the Daimistas have the right to practice their religion whether or not they use a psychoactive substance. In this sense, he comes close to, and he doesn't really explicate her work, but she's really, really good if you're interested in issues of legality in courts. Charlotte Walsh is an expert on the idea of something called cognitive liberty, which is an idea that spreads outside of psychedelics and can go into other forms of things too, and can kind of come over into issues of weirdly like net neutrality, like internet neutrality and technology issues, and like a lot of controversies around big corporations like Facebook or Meta. It doesn't sound like they relate at first, but they do once you start digging in. Remember liberalism, classic liberal philosophers like John Stuart Mill developed under their articulated a conception of liberalism in the 19th century, 1800s, right? They said that people should have the right to drink alcohol, to consume, against the temperance movements in the 19th century. The liberal position was that people should be able to put whatever they want into their bodies, and so and that comes from a liberalism as a political philosophy, right? Not as like Democrat liberal versus conservative Republican. So it's that rights-based focus of on the individual. So on the one hand, yeah, like this is like very interesting to me. On the one hand, Blainey comes out as a total liberal in terms of like political liberalism. He's probably liberal, like in terms of a like Democrat too. That's maybe for a different time. On the other hand, he wants to have religion recognized. So he wants a kind of liberalism with a built-in way to acknowledge the importance of spirituality. And that might not seem that controversial to you, like in terms of like a First Amendment U.S. approach. But I think that once we throw in the fact that this is a new religious movement and not like older forms of Christianity. I mean, you could say these are, newer forms of Christianity, I suppose. I mean, I shouldn't say I suppose. They're avowedly Christian. But I think what the problem that people run into with any kind of new religious movement and that politics of recognition in a liberal society is to what extent we take this notion of enchantment seriously. How do we find a way, even if we're sympathetic to so-called forms of enchantment? I'll just use that term right now for religiosity, spirituality. Like how tolerant of that are we in a society, right? Like how much, I mean, you can think of it this way with the Roe v. Wade stuff recently. Roe v. Wade was a case in the early 1970s that really wasn't that big, explosive of an issue. And most Protestant Christians in the United States did not care or think about abortion at all as an issue. Some, as I've said to other folks recently, some Catholics did because of this papal bull from the late 1800s called Novum Rerum, the new order of things, that emphasized this idea of the dignity of the person. And so sometimes you hear that kind of language, that kind of human rightsy kind of language being applied to unborn fetuses, as having rights. And so that comes from a combination of liberalism and the dignity of the person. The Protestant kind of counterpart to that issue in the United States was a split between the social gospel and what became the fundamentalist movement. People who wanted to take a strictly biblical approach and to treat the Bible particularly as a static and transcendent text that was all in one, composed by this notion of the Word of God. And so that was a reaction against the historicism of biblical studies that was coming out of Germany. And the social gospel was an attempt to look at what Jesus was doing in the Bible and to say, like, look, we need to apply that to the times now. We need to apply that to overcrowded cities. And so that creates a split in the United States between what becomes mainline Protestantism. That's the kind of people who've accepted to some extent or not the social gospel, and then a split, and then the so-called fundamentalists. And then later on we get the Scopes trial. I'm not going to lecture on the Scopes trial right now. That's what makes the Darwin and evolution issue really big, because of the attempt to to block the teaching of evolution in schools, and it shapes a lot of law in the U.S. And remains a big part of the popular consciousness. But I just don't have time to lecture on it today, so you can ask me about it in person if you want, or just look up the Scopes trial. It's still very pervasive. What's amazing, 100 years later, how pervasive in the popular culture Darwin and evolution and all of that versus the scientific folks are. And that, I guess that kind of resonates with what Blainey was talking in the way he was framing himself against scientific evangelism a few pages earlier. So just I'm going to blow through a few things because I'm starting to talk for a long time. He deals with competition among religious leaders, infighting within groups, breaking and splintering of groups, and that's what Protestantism has done ever since the Protestant Reformation, is just splinter into more and more groups. And so we have so many, like countless numbers of non-denominational Christian communities who sometimes will call themselves the only Christians, and will distinguish themselves as Christians versus Catholics, that sort of thing. Sexual abuse scandals he talks about on page 369. If you're writing on that or interested in that, you could reach back to the beginning of the quarter and the stuff I shared about the recent sexual misconduct at MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. There's a lot of, if you want to, it's an easy research paper topic if you still haven't thought of a research paper topic. And lots of stuff on Chacruna's website around sexual abuse. And he does mention the codes of conduct that some groups have. So Chacruna has like a sexual conduct thing for ayahuasca therapists or for psychedelic therapists. So you could look there. So these people are like trying to figure out how we're going to do this. If we're going to like have, are we going to have a licensing system? Are we like, who counts, and how do we have oversight over people who might be abusing power? He only brings up very, very briefly, and this is like one of my minor complaints with him, violence from around ayahuasca and ayahuasca communities. And this is on page 372. That's another theme. And the reason why I disagree with how little time he gives to it is because they are like serious issues. I mentioned kind of in passing in class that within the past, I think it was about a decade, maybe a little bit longer ago, there was a group of non-affiliated ayahuasca users who were doing ayahuasca healing, and they sacrificed a human baby in Chile. And it gave ayahuasca, of course, a really, really bad name. I mean, when you have groups that are doing that sort of stuff, and they're like, no matter how fringy, it taps into issues of cult scares, which are prevalent throughout our society. For those of you not in religious studies, just know that the way I've told some of you after class, that the way we use cult in religious studies doesn't necessarily have the negative connotation. So Christianity is a cult as well, but it, by definition, but it doesn't have the kind of pejorative or negative thing. And so if I'm talking about new religious movements, to call something a cult does not mean, that I'm saying that there's something bad and inherently bad about it. But that's another, like, you could take a whole class just on the cult scares of the 1980s. I've said that Dr. Carl Raschke here knows a lot about that because he went through it and wrote a lot about it at the time. On 373, Blainey says, the Daime movement, if they expose individual... sorry, I started mid-sentence. Most of the above exceptions to otherwise safe and orderly functioning of Santo Daime will be alleviated or totally solved by decriminalizing ayahuasca or Daimista rituals. So no, he doesn't say decriminalize ayahuasca, he says decriminalizing Daimista rituals. Is it the rituals that are made illegal? I'm not sure about that sentence. Making them subject to oversights just as any other religious groups. I don't know, like, like what other religious groups, like, I mean, this is basically the Eucharist, right? I think it's a open question. Like, to what extent are other religions having other people come in and regulate their ritual, especially, if we're talking about broader Christian community or the broader concept of the Eucharist, how much oversight comes from government in terms of the ritual itself. Now, it could be the substance or the wine or something like that, but it's unclear to me from Blainey's language there. But he says, so that's what he says, decriminalize the ritual. This would lift some of the pressure Dimistas might naturally feel when they fear that it would bring legal problems for the entire Daime movement if they expose individual wrongdoers. So the problem is when there are sexual abusers, because there's already such hostility in the secular society against the Daimistas, they don't want to speak out when problems have occurred. I find that kind of logic really faulty, but I can see it, and when we compare it to like the Catholic Church and sexual abuse scandals, which are rampant throughout the church, that there might be there's just it's maybe something to look into in terms of research. For their part, he says, if Daimistas turn a blind eye to foreseeable mishaps and criminal abuses or negligence within their ranks, this is what really threatens the viability of their practice. Indeed, Daimistas' aspiration to be tolerated as a genuine religion within Western societies hinges upon their ability to demonstrate that such infractions will not be tolerated within the church. So just look at how Blainey is positioning himself as the go-between between the churches who are considered outside of the liberal government, unrecognized, and their aspirations to be in it. And so that's the tension. The tension is always looking to an externalized government authority, in hopes that like the government has some sort of tolerant society that can appreciate different faiths, for example, right? But this is at the very heart of what we would call the political theology of liberalism and liberal society itself, which takes authority away from the church, takes authority away from the king, or the sovereign who was standing in as Christ on earth in many monarchical societies in Europe. And the sovereign has been replaced by this thing that we call government. And so in some forms of Christianity, as I've mentioned in the lectures dealing with German philosophy, the idea was that the state actually becomes the embodiment of Christ in the so-called Christian cultural society historically. And so all of this gets very, very heady, and it gets to thinking about like, why in a religion like Catholicism do we have more than 2,000 years of commentary, not for all of Catholicism, but we have close to 2,000 years. And so it's not just always about the sort of fundamentalist tenets of faith, because there is this concept that that temporality has moved on in a way. And so, the big theologians like St. Augustine and stuff have whole 1,000-page tomes about questions about what separates the heavenly city, city of God is what I'm thinking of, the heavenly city versus the earthly city. And so all of these questions, they become political, but I want us to hold at bay questions about just any kind of clear separation between even the idea of governance as we have it in a liberal society, without and then bracket that Blainey's argument that he seems pretty comfortable that governments should be the ones who get to decide and that should help regulate. At the same time, if we look at conservative Christian groups lately, in conservative Christianity, you have movements like the Benedict option. There was a book by this. His name starts with a D. I'm sorry, I can't. My mind is blanking right now. Rod something. Look it up. The Benedict option, which seeks to return to a Benedictine version of like medieval, not even late medieval version of Christianity, and it is intentionally internationalist. The Protestant evangelical movement, with its missionaries all around the world, and especially throughout South America, they have changed the landscape of South America so drastically that I think the ayahuasca religions are very much part of the same movement. I don't think that they're looking to like a US type of government. I mean, you might have like Republicans who want to use the government to, or right, like the so-called Christian right, who want to make the government of the United States into an ideological tool of their particular thing. But I think broadly speaking, I think the evangelical movement has been helping border crossers, for example, because the concept is that one serves a higher authority than what the nation and state could be. So I think that there's a lot of murkiness behind. I mean, Blainey's already given us 400 pages, but like, I don't think it's as convenient as he puts it here. He talks about the post-secular a little bit on page 377. He says this entails a post-secular cosmopolitical compromise rooted in the humility of believers and non-believers, both recognizing the essential mysteriousness of human existence. He talks about the secularization thesis on page 379. So if you're just looking to look at any of this stuff, he contrasts with Scientology on page 383. He says at the bottom of page 384, as stated at the outset, I'm an agnostic, an ontological position I still hold even after my field work. Counter to John Bielecki's survey of methodological atheism in the Anthropology of Christianity subfield, or the conflation of methodological agnosticism with atheism in Dawson's 2013 book, which is called Santo Daime. Dawson's book on Santo Daime, we should beware the hegemonic illusion of the rational obviousness of secular disenchantment. I'm going to just repeat that again, just because it's a great little bundle of, we should beware the hegemonic illusion of the rational obviousness of secular disenchantment. And he's citing Charles Taylor there, who is a Catholic theologian who wrote, I've mentioned in class, big book, like 800 pages long, called A Secular Age. And Charles Taylor said that modernity, he's not the only one to say this sort of thing at all, but the modernity, as opposed to like antiquity and maybe medieval times, modernity is characterized by the buffered self, that we've created these institutional structures, these legal structures that discipline us as individuals, as a society, so much that we think of ourselves as rights-bearing individuals, which is just not the way the general person walking around trying to avoid the Black Plague is dealing with things. In medieval or antiquity, Charles Taylor says that self, it's a different kind of self, that selves are historical. And that's really important because in psychedelic studies, people always want to talk about the self as being this kind of static and transcendent idea that doesn't change over time. But the critical theory world that I come from, like Michel Foucault, has done a lot of work on this, but I'll just keep using Charles Taylor right now because he wrote a book called Sources of the Self too, on this. That type of world wants to see the self as a historical phenomenon. In this class this semester or quarter, I've placed that question in relationship to the question of mystical experience, because so much of the mystical experience is formed onto the idea of a subject or a self. even if it's a subject or a self that is obliterated and temporarily communes with a divine power and then is reconstructed. I mean, if they went, and I said this early in the quarter, like if you just obliterate and you go out into particles or you become one with God or whatever, and you don't reintegrate, then there's no talking to people. But once you have reintegrated, once you've come down, and however you want to use this kind of language from the classic psychedelic experience book by Timothy Leary, which says that it loosely follows the Tibetan Book of the Dead. I should say more about that in class. And it was at Huxley's suggestion, but the translation that they're using was influenced by the Theosophy movement. So there's a lot of problems there with calling it just a translation of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. But in that idea, it's like, well, you become enlightened and then you face these demons, and you have to keep facing the demons and enter the clear light of the void to get enlightened. But most people don't become enlightened and they succumb, so they come back into a rebirth process. And that's basically, what we're dealing with any kind of psychedelic therapy. Unless you died or disintegrated in some sort of way during your psychedelic trip, you have reincarnated. You have come back down. And so the question is not so much like what the experience, what the psychoactive substances do. It's what are you going to do with your experience of all of that stuff from an integrated state. In the same way, this is why some scholars will say that mysticism as a phenomenon is only a kind of a genre of writing. It only comes out with people who start having to write down and tell their stories, or other people telling stories about them, to defend and try and show that they did have this actual authentic engagement with God or the divine or whatever. And so who are they fighting against, right? Some other version of society or official priests or whatever. And so that kind of aspect of mysticism that we might kind of fit appropriately with a kind of radical movements, or sometimes radical social movements, or outsiderness, is a phenomenon that's influenced by a radical attention to subjectivity itself in the so-called mystic. And then it becomes a question of trust, right? Because if we take mysticism as mustos, then we, which is the initiate from that way back in lecture 1, then I think we are dealing with the questions of what information does the person who's had the experience, who's had the communion with the divine, I'll just call it the divine, who's had the mystical experience, what then does their experience have to say to us communally back here on Earth, right? Or back here in society? I mean, so it's like or what else would be the point of telling people that you had a mystical experience, or coming back to begin with, right? So dealing with the issues of, you can call it this world, secular issues in the old Christian sense of secular. So the term secular comes from Christianity, and it just meant the priests who deal with the laity, who deal with actual people, and not the monks who've gone into monasteries and who've done some sort of renunciation, or are dealing with some sort of self-disciplining sort of asceticism. But what do we do? What do we do with the masses? What do we do with the people who don't believe? What do we do with the people who can't function very well in life? And so, of course, psychedelics hit all of this because the therapy stuff. And so back to Blainey, I'm going to start wrapping things up here. So he's talked about the problems, and then he's come back and he says, these people still need to be defended, the ayahuasca religious groups. And he's giving all sorts of advice, and says that, they should work in conjunction with governments. They should be recognized by governments, by liberal, tolerant governments, I guess he would say. Bottom of page 388. Hence, future psychedelic therapists should be considered underqualified if they have not completed rigorous psycho-spiritual training with accredited programs akin to multi-faith models found with the Canadian Association for Spiritual Care, the Association for Clinical Pastoral Education, or the European Council for Pastoral Care and Counseling. One envisions that spiritual care training would be a vital component of specialized clinical education departments in emerging degree programs, such as the Certificate in Psychedelic Assisted Therapies and Research from the Center for Psychedelic Therapies and Research at California Institute of Integral Studies, or the Psychedelics and Spirituality Studies Initiative at University of Ottawa. And so here he is. There he is. He's like, I mean, I appreciate that he's just kind of laying out, this is what needs to happen. And I want you to think back to earlier discussions that we had this semester, because a lot of students in this class with very little reading about psychedelics were already making similar type like claims about like, this is what we should do. Well, these people should be allowed, and these people who should be allowed to do it. That was the whole question. And we were having this whole discussion without like being lawyers, without having trained very much in religious studies, unless you're a grad student. We were having a very I would say, privileged conversation, in which I guess is what we do in privileged universities in the United States, is we hash this stuff out. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't talk about it at all, but it's interesting to me how willing some people are to talk about these issues without knowing too much about what the groundwork looks like or what other people have said and done before, which is why I focus on scholarship, right? So I focus on reading for the class. So in his closing remarks, he again is avowing this liberal value of toleration toward mutual respect and toleration. He says, it may appear at first glance that Dimistas are recolonizing ayahuasca by Christianizing a sacrament that originated in non-Christian indigenous contexts. Cultural appropriation is indeed a legitimate and extremely sensitive concern in emergent psychedelic communities. For instance, at a recent meeting of MAPS, an indigenous questioner called out the white privilege of a conference attendees by a presentation by Gabor Mate, who wrote a famous book called In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts. It's still a good book, but it, as Blainey covers, like Gabor Mate had to be humbled, and he took it, and he wrote in his second preface, he did his own kind of acknowledging of his issues with privilege. I don't think it's a one-time thing that people can do. And here you probably can already guess, like, I think I would probably give a stronger argument towards how all of this affects indigenous communities, and that's probably what I'll focus on in class next week and when I come back. And you know that about me already as a professor, so I don't need to say too much about it today. I will say that I appreciate Mark Blainey for citing me. I mean, it's very affirming as a scholar to know it's like, yeah, well, Blainey is like, I might not agree with everything that he says, but he's even read my books. Like, I mean, he's read like more than my book. He's read articles. I don't know that he cites my dissertation, but it might not have been done yet when he was going to press for this book. But he's definitely seen my work out in the community. And what more can we ask of each other as researchers, but that we work in a community as researchers and we do the best that we can to acknowledge the research that has already been done, right? Not endless appeals to, well, new research on the brain, blah, blah, blah. Like, tells us. We hear in psychedelic communities and in conventional discourse on psychedelics over and over and over again. The Leary stories, the Aldous Huxley stories. It's created a muckiness so that it's very hard to study the material. I've tried in our course this quarter to guide us through it, to push us through some of that murkiness so that when you come out, you have a hold on some of that stuff. You can read endlessly on the history of psychedelics up to this point. But what we have to deal with right now is the people who are doing the kind of cutting edge research, the people who have not thought enough about religion, so that's Blainey's critique of Carhart Harris, and I really love Carhart Harris, but do you side with Blainey and say that Carhart Harris and his scientific evangelicals are not cognizant enough of the fact that nobody really knows what the entire cosmos is really based on? Or do you go with the strict scientific side of what can be proved in a laboratory, for example, or with human subject research? I think we can do something between those two things. So the field of psychedelic studies is so interdisciplinary and so broad that we need to be able to see the tensions in between them, which is why I have had a rhetorical approach to this. I wanted to, there's a long passage I'd underlined here towards the end. Page 395. Thus, for European Fardados, Santo Daime is actually a way of curing psycho-spiritual sickness at the heart of the Western project. Wow. So now this is a whole other angle. So they're actually the cures. They see their religion as the cure for the decline that liberal society has brought, that secular society has brought. So if that's how they see themselves, if they see liberal society as having been in decline and needing to be healed, are followers of such a movement really likely to embrace the authority of the state over them when it comes to regulating things? Now, Blainey wants to. Blainey's totally comfortable with that. But if we take seriously what he's saying about these people with faith, they might be a lot more like more well-known evangelical Christians, right? Who they don't care. They don't like the people who are converting Catholic people, helping people border across at the southern border and then converting them, and offering them pathways to citizenship. So by saying if you join our church, then you can meet girls, you can maybe marry somebody here, you can get citizenship in the United States if you marry someone. And so they grow their communities intentionally across the border because they see that God is above any kind of spiritual border. So come back to this paragraph on 395 again. For European Fardados, Santo Daime is actually a way of curing psycho-spiritual sickness at the heart of the Western project, unlike the violent European colonizers profiled by Taussig. That's Michael Taussig, great book on shamanism. Daimistas are engaged in a critical self-reflection housed within a moral system of compassion toward other people and responsibility for the whole earth. For them, the Christ that returned from the Amazon jungle has been purified of colonialist pollutions, arriving back to Europe through the Daime liquid and Master Irenaeus' teachings. Fardados herald Daime as a newly reformed Christianity, whereby each individual devotee seeks to decolonize their own mind by stripping themselves of their European or Eurocentric/egocentric attachments. Daime is a means for folks raised within a Christian discourse to better comprehend the polyphasic worldview of indigenous peoples. Or sorry, yes, there are real concerns about Western appropriations of indigenous and theogen traditions, but my fieldwork suggests that European fardados are themselves suffering condemnation from Western authorities because they have adopted a shamanic affinity for plant-based alterations of consciousness. If anything, the theology of Santo Daime represents the strategic appropriation of Christianity by Afro-Brazilian and indigenous ayahuasca traditions. And that, there are so many issues in that paragraph, things that I want to call attention to. One is that slash mark between Eurocentric and egocentric. If you're taking the critical theory perspective that the self is something that is a historical formation over time, what is the self's relationship with the ego? And if we're dissolving the ego, are we inherently doing something decolonial or not? You know, from my own perspective and work, and from even earlier in this book, so I don't even need to go into my work too much. There's the earlier Daimista who said that they don't feel guilt about genocide. They don't see this as an appropriation of indigenous anything. Yes, colonialism happened, but it was in the past, and so they don't have to. They can sort of acknowledge it and move on, but they don't. There isn't like any kind of official acknowledging, right? That like I don't see any of these people in the land back movement in the up here. They might have those kinds of politics, but it didn't seem that has not been present at all in this text. He says that Daime is a means for folks raised within a Christian discourse to better comprehend the polyphasic worldview of indigenous peoples. If I just took that sentence, I might say maybe. But Blainey's book has not talked at all about indigenous worldviews and what they are. So I want you to be very, very careful. Now, he didn't say that was going to be his subject matter, and so fair. But when you make a claim like that at the end of your book to an audience of readers, like who most of them don't know anything about indigenous worldviews either, that becomes kind of an issue. That becomes like a sticking point for me. The last sentence again. If anything, theology from Santo Daime represents a strategic appropriation of Christianity by Afro-Brazilian and indigenous ayahuasca traditions. I want to say that throughout mestizo populations, throughout South America, even 20th century indigenista movements, indigenista movements in the 1800s look different than the 20th century ones. This is very complex stuff, and it has to do with Latin American politics, like nation-state politics. And I'm nearing the end of how much I can talk today, so I'm not going to go into that. But it's a very, very complex thing. But I will say that mestizo populations, so mixed populations of European descendants and indigenous folks throughout South and Central America, but especially South America and especially over near Peru, will make this kind of claim. They will and do that ayahuasca has its own agency. So remember way back to Sylvia Masterini Capo's piece from earlier this quarter. That's why I put it at the beginning, so that when we close with this, that ayahuasca has agency. Masterini Capo wants to deal with a lot more various kinds of agency, but Blainey's subjects, informants, want to say that ayahuasca is the second coming of Christ. And so the second coming of Christ has come to redeem the jungle, the indigenous people, the wretched of the earth, to use a phrase from Frantz Fanon, and that in that redeeming work, they are defeating colonialism, they're appropriating, they're using the master's tools to break down the master's house. And that it's ayahuasca is beyond us, because ayahuasca is Jesus, is beyond any individual's intention. Ayahuasca is just going to do what it's going to do. Ayahuasca is going to spread around the world, and it's spreading really fastly because that's what the world needs, and it's Jesus coming back to save everybody. And in that sense, I think that Blainey has tapped into something that is really present in terms of South American culture. I would want you as individuals to buffer that against whether you feel like the European subjects that Blainey has studied for 400 pages, whether you think that they really have done decolonizing work. And yes, I'll admit, you can hear in my tone that that I have my suspicions about that kind of thing. But you get to decide for yourself. Your grade isn't, dependent on whether or not you agree with me. It's just something that you should think about, having read this book. Do you think that they, just of the things that people said in the book, do you think that they've decolonized? Does your own concept of decolonization, to come back to class conversations that we've brought up, particularly Diana has brought up, decoloniality or decolonization and versus decolonizing. What is your own sort of relationship to that process or to those words? And so that'll have to play into your decisions about how you assess Blainey's work. But I think that's something that's definitely at heart at the end, and something to take from this book and wrestle with. And then finally, he says on page 401, I hope the reader has gained, if the reader has gained any insight from the present volume, it's that many psychonauts across the world are finding a much cheaper, but nonetheless wondrous inner view, INNERVIEU, inner view effect from the entheogenic experience of Earth. And then he talks about the sui scope thing. Remember, I just want to, because Blainey's talked about it in other articles, the sui scope idea, that what psychedelics are like. So this is not necessarily a religious thing, but it's a tool to look at your inner self. That's the way he wants to use it. So he's advertising for that thing, that concept at the end, which is his right. He's fair enough. He's done a really good job in his research. On page 406, there was one last thing that I had underlined that I questioned. He says, if there is one thing that ethnophenomenology proves, it is that a despairing Western world may have much to learn from indigenous technologies of entheogenic therapy. Now, the thing that bugs me about that is that he has spent no time in this book really saying what an indigenous technology is. Indigenous people use ayahuasca. Maybe they were the first to figure out what ayahuasca is. A technology is a human-invented concept to begin with, techne. So go back to some of our discussions about writing and the history of writing earlier. Writing is a technology. Language is a technology. Language itself, that we speak with each other. So what is an indigenous technology? I'm not sure that he's explored that, because he hasn't really focused on indigenous people. But there's this way that on the periphery of everything around ayahuasca stuff, there's this appeal and this talk about indigenous this, indigenous that. And it's so much talking about people who really haven't spent a whole bunch of time around indigenous people. And then, within South America, there's so many different gradations of mestizo, and I've talked about racial categories. I've talked about reasons why even indigenous people in South America have had good reason to to not identify as indigenous, even if they have that as their background, because the social movements of the broader nationalistic indigenista movement has presented Peru or whatever nation state you're living in as being inherently indigenous, but also giving citizenship to people. Or the far left movements like the FARC rebels, or the Shining Path in Peru, the communist movements, who said, "Oh, you're indigenous. It doesn't matter that you're Indio. It doesn't matter that, like, we don't deal with race. We're all one citizen. We're all one comrade." And so that felt like a step up. Citizenship felt like a step up for many indigenous people in the past century. So, how do we think about the word indigenous? It's so complex. So we know that it's a colonialist. It arises as a signal of the colonial situation, but this colonial situation is immensely complex, and it's a minor critique of an otherwise great book, so very, very good job to Mark Blainey, as somebody who has focused more on the indigenous stuff. From my point of view, I would want to qualify a number of statements that he says, especially when they're statements just in passing about indigenous technologies. Okay. I've talked for a long time and I haven't really gotten to lethaby at all. So I'll just save that for when I come back, and I'm going to upload this now because it's an hour before your normal class time, and I need to ice my knee. So I'll see you on Thursday. Thanks for dealing with me this week.